everyone. I want to start out by thanking everyone for clicking on this video, and I hope you will enjoy. On November 3rd, 2025, at 0044 hours, a westbound priority intermodal train from Chicago, Illinois derailed at milepost 240.9 on the Union Pacific's Harrington subdivision. The train originated in Union Pacific's Global 2 intermodal terminal in North Lake, Illinois, which is a suburb of Chicago. The train was headed to the Los Angeles Transportation Center in Southern California with 141 loaded railcars. This train is typically run with two types of cargo, general merchandise in the intermodal containers and new vehicles transported in auto-rack railcars. Trains of this size and priority usually have multiple engines to provide extra pulling power for faster acceleration and better fuel efficiency. In addition to engines on the front end, locomotives are also placed in the middle of the train. This is known to help with the draft and buff forces that a train will experience throughout its journey. This is especially prominent in hilly or mountainous areas. The draft and buff forces are caused by slack in the railcar couplers. According to the National Transportation Safety Board, or NTSB for short, quote, "Slack action is the free movement or travel of a railcar before it transmits motion and force to an adjoining coupled car. Force from acceleration or braking is applied down to the train through mechanical couplers at both ends of the railcar. Because there is travel, or slack, between the ends of railcar couplers, and because the couplers are often combined with shock-absorbing draft gear that allows itself a certain amount of travel, each railcar experiences some free movement before it receives the force applied by the locomotive or braking system." End quote. A draft force is created when the locomotive begins pulling cars forward, which reduces the slack in the draft gear mechanisms and couplers. Sometimes this quick reduction of the slack results in a loud crash sound. Subsequently, a buff force is created when the front end of a railcar pushes against the rear of the next. This also reduces the amount of slack in the railcars by pushing the coupler of one car into the other. This type of force is among some of the most dangerous if not managed properly. As the Union Pacific's Harrington subdivision rounds the curve at Medora and begins the downgrade descent into Hutchinson, the track speed lowers to a 30 miles per hour permanent speed limit. Once a westbound train crests the hill and begins the downhill descent, the brakes must be applied at a relatively rapid rate to meet the required speed limit. If the buff force and reduction of slack in the couplers is created too quickly, the rest of the train will put a lot of pressure on the front of the train as the cars begin slowing down. A type of railcar that can particularly cause problems is the auto-rack car. These kinds of railcars are typically lighter weight in design and can be particularly dangerous when they are empty or put in a vulnerable place within the consist of the train. A good example of this in action is the August 2019 derailment in Canadian National's Vaughan, Ontario, Macmillan Yard. A remote control hump yard operation was pulling 82 cars and was controlled by a single Canadian National employee. As the train was rounding a 15-degree left-hand curve, the 26th car from the locomotives derailed and caused the subsequent 8 cars to also derail. It was discovered previously that the remote control units had coupled onto a cut of 24 autorack cars. The train added more freight cars onto the back of the autoracks. This new cut of freight weighed more than the empty autoracks on the front, making the train tail-end heavy. A few minutes after the train began moving again, the remote-controlled units lost connection with the controller, automatically putting the units in idle and full independent braking. With this sudden braking, the 26th car derailed and pulled on the coupler of the 27th car. This caused cars number 27, 28, and 29 to separate from their trucks and tip over. During the investigation, it was discovered that 44% of the train's weight was in the rear 25% of the train. This was listed as the major contributing factor, alongside the abrupt braking that caused the train to stringline, as the railroad calls it. The UP derailment in Hutchinson was different than the Canadian National incident because the autorack cars were loaded instead of empty. These loaded autoracks were still in front of the heavy intermodal cars that made up the back half of the consist. In addition to the intermodal cars that were behind the autoracks, there were two distributed power units in the middle of the train, which are remotely controlled by the head-end unit's computer systems. The front engines and other engines in a train's consist can be controlled independently using a computerized software called Energy Management System, or EMS for short. Think of it like a smart cruise control. According to an article from Union Pacific's website, EMS looks at a train's length and weight, the terrain and curvature of the tracks, and chooses the best train handling strategy to control throttle and dynamic braking in order to manage the push and pull of the couplers. It operates simultaneously with the locomotive's PTC systems. The goal of installing these systems in locomotives is to maximize fuel efficiency. Wabtec and Progress Rail, two companies that build train locomotives, have been installing EMS in the newer engines for use on their Class 1 customers. This software system can provide recommendations for how the engineer should control the train. Since the EMS system also works in tandem with the train's PTC systems, it can also dictate how the train moves if the engineer does not take action. In our case, this played a very crucial role in the ZG2LC's derailment. According to the official rail accident report, quote, "The crew on the ZG2LC-02 were forced by the EMS system to take control of their train. Because the EMS system had forced the engineer to slow the train, the engineer began to apply the dynamic brakes on the lead locomotives. However, the throttle on the mid-train DPU locomotives had not been reduced before the front end's brakes had been applied. This caused the back and the middle of the train to put extremely high pressure on the front end's brakes and leading cars. The buff force on the front rail cars caused the wheels of the front cars to, quote, roll the rail. Of the 26 cars that derailed, most of them were autoracks, but a few intermodal cars also came off the tracks. The official Federal Railroad Administration code for the derailment was Train Accident Cause Code H503, which according to the FRA's Train Accident Cause Code sheet reads, buffing or slack action excessive train handling. This means the stress on the couplers from the mid-train DPUs pushing and the front engines braking caused the train to exceed the proper amount of coupler and draft gear stress that the cars are rated to withstand. Many of the derailed cars were able to be re-railed with cranes and specialized lift equipment. The cars that were not able to be re-railed were dragged away from the tracks down the embankment to be scrapped on site. Once they were back on the rails, the cars toward the rear of the train were moved to Medora with the DPU engines. The cars near the front remained coupled to the lead locomotives, which had been moved to the south side of the 17th Street crossing, parallel to the staging tracks at Slade. The re-railed autoracks were then put into the staging tracks to be sent back east for repair. We caught the Hutch local switcher towing the autoracks to Morton Yard, where they'd be picked up by Local 55 to be taken to Harrington. due to liability reasons, the vehicles that were in the auto rack cars also had to be scrapped. Over the next few weeks, we caught them being scrapped in the ditch along K61 highway. The first order of business was to repair the track as soon as possible. Union Pacific hired a few subcontractors to work on the cleanup, including Mainline Services of Kansas City and R.J. Corman based out of Kentucky. These guys worked very quickly, and the tracks were reopened almost 21 hours later. The first train through was another UPZ train with the symbol ZG4CI. This train passed through the derailment site around 21:30 hours on November 4th. Over the next few days, work on the tracks would continue as they added ballast, fixed rails, and allowed other trains through after the work windows were cleared. Lots of people gathered at the corner of 23rd and Halstead Street, directly across from the derailment site. Because the trees that previously would have blocked the view of the main line were now removed, the view was exceptional. But with the gathering of rail fans comes the spreading of rumors. Let's discuss a few of those here. Number 1. The engineer didn't know the area due to the new signal that was installed. There was a new signal installed at this location a few weeks previous. However, there is no way to know that that was the cause for certain, as the official accident report does not make a mention of this. Number 2. UP was rerouting trains onto the BNSF to detour the trains around the derailment. Actually, this is a very reasonable theory. I had a scanner on hand and was able to hear the BNSF dispatcher contacting UP trains at Pratt, Kansas. The crossover at South Hutchinson had also been lit for a UP train to cross over and enter the BNSF's La Junta subdivision. However, shortly after the signals were lit, they went dark and BNSF ceased contacting the Union Pacific trains. The obvious conclusion is that BNSF was about to take trains to be rerouted, but for some reason the plans were canceled. The UP trains would have to wait until the derailment site was reopened in order to continue eastbound. The entire cost of the derailment was over $2.2 million in damages. These damage costs were split into two categories: damage to the railroad infrastructure and damages of the equipment. The infrastructure damage totaled $578,348, while the equipment damages totaled $1,602,572. 2 crewmen were on board the train, both having worked just over 6 hours on the clock. There were no casualties or injuries reported. To sum it all up, the Union Pacific's ZG2LC derailment seems to have been a combination of factors that together contributed to the wreck. As the EMS system forced the engineer to make rapid adjustments to the train, the brakes were applied to the front of the train while the mid-train DPU locomotives continued pushing. This caused 26 out of 141 loaded railcars to derail at 42 miles an hour at milepost 240.9 on the Union Pacific's Harrington subdivision. The track was closed for just over 21 hours before traffic resumed. I hope you all enjoyed this brief coverage of the Hutchinson, Kansas Union Pacific train derailment. If you'd like to see more documentary-style content, check out the Mini Train Documentaries playlist on the left of your screen. To see more content on this channel, click the channel icon on the right of your screen. Thank you again for stopping by, and see you later.